So my name is Rex Cannon. I'm from the University of Tennessee, but I decided to take the work that I did there for quite some time in neurofeedback, Alzheimer's disease, most developmental disorders, and take research and translate it into real application in the world. So that's what I'm doing now. And currently I'm the president of the International Society for Neurofeedback and Research. So I will try my best to stick to science. Let me tell you how weird a PhD is. It's not easy being one of those people, right? So I get in the room, well, as I was coming here, I make this fabulous scientific slideshow. I mean, it had all this stuff in there. Then I see kids running around, family members, and I go in last night and I'm like, God, no! So I had to know my audience. So anything I put up here, I will take the time to translate it into just layman's terms, because my children often tell me, why do you talk like you talk? And I'm like, what do you mean? Well, it's the things you say we don't understand. I'm like, well, I thought I did not speak in jargon. I thought I had fixed that, but evidently I have not. So I'll just begin. All right, so this is what I'll try to cover quickly. Some things I'll go through a little bit quick, some things not, some take more time. So I'll cover what EEG is and its quantitative components, what neurofeedback is, the basic concepts, what operant conditioning is, some things you may or may not have heard of depending on your experience and what you do as a professional and just being in the world. Neuroimaging techniques as operant conditioning methods, because technology has afforded a means to do things we couldn't have considered 20 years ago. So these are really exciting times in the study of the brain. Then a brief touch on networks and functional connectivity, and this means targets for what we would train, practice, and learning in the human brain and why that is important, and syndrome-specific symptoms. You know, can you train an area that's associated with particular disorders? So, and conclusions and future directions for research and what have you. Okay, thank you. All right, so the history of EEG started back in 1875. For whatever reason, Richard Caton thought it would be a good idea to place this little tin electrode on a rabbit's cortex and record what happened. So this continued on to 1924, where Berger, he did the first measurement of the electrical current on human cortex. 1934, 1940s, and up to the 1950s. And it's like it took a pause, and it was mostly just featured in neurology, and it was for epilepsy or sleep studies. But it has regained a lot of momentum, because we are electrical beings, if you like. I don't know what that means. But there is a lot of electricity in our body, at least in our brain. And it performs some function, even though we're not sure quite what that is yet. Okay, continue. So this is if you break it down. So the electroencephalograph, well, it writes the brain's electrical activity. So you put an electrode, you record the EEG, amplify it, tie it to a little piece of chalk, and it will make these scribbles. And that is what the EEG is. The problems associated with it, well, we see this if you take it from 19 channels, 32 channels, 64 channels, 128 channels, 256 channels. Because I have done work with infants with 128 electrodes, and that can be messy. It can be fun as well. So we think of it as spontaneous, chaotic, or random noise. And there is a camp over here that says that may not be true. There can be purpose in randomness. We just have to be able to find what it is and understand what it is. So I still find this to be an exciting topic. I never get bored with it. Although sometimes it gives me a headache just thinking about some of these formulas and what have you. Okay. So EEG is typically a sinusoidal. And this would be that wave over there. So it's a sine wave with 3 corresponding points that can be measured. So if you have a really good EEG recording, you get to see how beautiful it is. And it really is quite beautiful. So with this over here, just to give you an example, so you have radio, right? and it travels in these waveforms. You have AM and FM, and those waves have a carrier. There's a carrier signal. That's how you get the information on a radio frequency. Well, I wonder if the brain can operate in such a capacity. And they say, well, it must, to some degree. We have not been able to filter this out yet. I suppose the coolest thing that I've ever seen was Dr. Lubar, when I was at the University of Tennessee. He recorded EEG in an analog form. He filtered it through into digital. Then he played it over speakers. So this is going to be really weird to you, but all of our brains make a sound. And it goes, it sounds really weird. But that is the freakiest thing I've ever encountered. I'm like, are you kidding me? So if it produces sound on a radio, we each produce some kind of sound, if you will. So that's pretty interesting. Just a tidbit of information for you. Okay. This is the traditional EEG frequency bands we look at. So you have delta, and that would be the slow frequency, and that's 1 to 3 hertz. And there are some EEG studies that measure even lower than that. So it could be 0.01 hertz, 0.05 hertz, 0.05 hertz. So I mean, there can be signals that are at work that travel a distance of 10 seconds, or 16 seconds, or 20 seconds. I mean, we really don't know yet. So, you know, I guess most of the time, delta has been associated with sleep, and that is true, but it's also found to be very important to some cognitive process. That's because it's always there. You rarely see a signal without. I mean, the EEG is either additive or subtractive. You will rarely find one frequency without the addition of all other frequencies. So, and then you have beta, alpha, theta, and gamma. So gamma would be the really fast frequencies, and all of these have a range of amplitude. They show up on the cortex. Typically, but not always, the slower frequencies, high markable waves, will be more attributed to some dysfunction in the brain, if you will. So for years, theta and ADHD, they go hand in hand. The way I think of it is, if you have information in your brain and it's traveling in a wave, and let's pretend that wave is at 200 microvolts, then information is traveling over that wave, then it's going to go, and sometimes bits and pieces of information are going to fall out. Data is going to be lost, because that signal is just working so hard to get where it's got to get. Information may not get there at all. So in some cases, what we want is to reduce the frequency and reduce the amplitude of those frequencies, because faster is better for our brain. Because you may not know this, but I think of our brain as it's the most phenomenal computer in the history of the universe, but it's also the laziest one. It wants to learn things quickly, without too much effort. It wants to practice it, get it, and go. And then it does not want to have to use energy for that task again. So it becomes a very efficient process, but it also aids us in learning. Because once we get something, then we open up resources for learning something else. And that's what our brain likes to do. Okay. So in the quantitative EEG, and this is actually this is starting to get a lot of attention now, because it's better if we could not like the DSM, because there's problems with that, but there's always going to be problems in dealing with any kind of disorder. But if we could build random, normative samples, or even clinical samples of brain activity, then you would be able to compare an individual with that sample, and with psychometric testing, at least have some improvement in diagnostic accuracy. That's my goal, is to be able, if I say a person has ADD or some type of brain damage or whatever, to be able to increase the accuracy with which I see it. So you collect the EEG and you compare it to, there are quite a few databases available now. But you want to take the person and record an eyes closed baseline. Sometimes that could be 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 20 minutes. and an eyes open baseline. Eyes closed, eyes open. So, and people say, well, what kind of information does that offer? Well, it could be mind wandering, it could be daydreaming, it could be just sitting there, whatever. But I published a paper in 2012 where, I don't know if you're all familiar with the default network of the brain. Well, I'll go through that later, but I'll just touch on it right now because it becomes quite important. So, if you're sitting in a chair, or I put you in an MRI machine, I give you specific instructions. I need you to be still, control your eye movements, don't clench your jaws, just try to maintain as much body control as you can. Because if you do not, I cannot use your data in an MRI machine, nor can I use your data in EEG. So the person really has to self-regulate and attend to the task they were given. Well, I had people write out their experience during baseline, and a few people, I don't know why, thought that we could read their brains, read their minds, and what have you. But even that is attention to the process. So everybody indicated that it was attention, self-regulation, not i.e. resting, as it's called. It's called a resting state. So in that paper, I've just presented this, and if you just really think about it, if you're going to get a cognitive task and subtract it from that process, then you have to consider being still as a complex behavior. But there's one not more important, because you have to be able to attend to what is being given to you, or it can never enter into your experience. And that goes back to William James a long time ago. So attention becomes a vital cognitive component, if you will. And in some disorders, when attention is severely impaired, it doesn't matter what kind of cognitive test or IQ test, whatever it is I give you, you're not going to be able to do it. Yes? Is it on? All right. Is it on now? Okay. All right. All right, thank you. I thought it was on. All right, so you take the QEEG and you measure several different frequency bands here, but you also measure connectivity, that'd be coherence, asymmetry, or even phase, and that's synchrony between the signals. So I'll cover those in a little detail, but not too much, because it's one of those things that makes people's mouth drop open. But this one here, compared to the database, the light green would be 1 to 1.5 standard deviations outside of it, and the blue, dark blue, would be less power, and that would be nearly 3 standard deviations. And that's really only important if the database has neuropsychological scores that actually show that there is not an abnormality present. And a lot of databases do have that. So this is but one example. This was a girl I saw almost 2 years ago. So she showed up, and this is her pre-training eyes open baseline compared to this database. And she had a diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder, anxiety, ADHD, and she also had been kicked out of school twice for just inappropriate texting, all kinds of stuff. Well, she was adopted, she was from Russia, no birth history, no information about parental or genetic history, anything like that. So we did about 15 sessions, and then I just took a session of her actually engaged in the neurofeedback process and compared that to the baseline. Because yes, it might be apples to oranges, but if self-regulation is a present state when a person is actually wearing the cap, trying to comply with the task, then you see this weird coherence back here in the back. So that means that during this particular task, when she is attending to some stimulus, trying to regulate her body and comply with it, that much of the cortex is devoted to that particular task. So you have to think about what resources are left for her to gain more information from the outside world. And I don't think there's not a lot. So it turns out we referred her for an MRI, and she had the tiniest, maybe about 4.5 millimeters, a lesion in the left parietal lobe. And people say, well, you would think the executive functions and what have you, that'd be more attributed to the frontal lobes. Well, those are the kind of myths that neuroscience is taking away. And this is why these are exciting times for me. So this left parietal lobe becomes quite important to things, self-regulation, but not just learning a thing, applying it to a self, a me that's different from you, because we all have different experience. However, we have all practiced and mastered something that is sometimes similar, sometimes very different. But this young lady could not understand the social rules. She could repeat it back to you, but she couldn't do it. So, with some extra schooling and things like that, she's actually progressed quite well. But sometimes there are organic reasons for typical, behavioral issues, whatever you want to call it. I just think everything's brain. That's how I think. Okay, get to the next one. So this is a paper we published in 2010. And really I'm just trying to emphasize that we can use neuroimaging to see a thing and actually know better what that thing is. So for this little boy, he was brought to me with attentional symptoms, and his teachers actually said, I just don't think he's motivated to do anything. So we went through a few sessions, and his EEG was just so dysfunctional, so much high amplitude, that I thought it was quite strange, so I referred him to get an MRI. He did have a stroke when he was young, at birth. He had seizures. He did not have them at the time of his discharge from the hospital. And he didn't appear to have any odd behavior up until the point in time he came to see us. But memory, attention, visual spatial information, it was just, he couldn't do it. I mean, it's not that he didn't put forth the effort, he just couldn't do it. So this is a lesion in the the right parietal, but also see all the real dark information in the EEG, in the MRI. So it's encephalomalacia, and that's just atrophy of the tissue. So he may have had 2 or 3 strokes after the first stroke, but they didn't know. So by interacting with the child, you could not tell this was in his brain, unless you gave him a thing to do. And then he couldn't remember names, couldn't remember, 4 or 5 things. He could hold 3 pictures in memory, but he couldn't hold words. He just it wouldn't stick. So for that, I was quite amazed by this, because you would expect him to be really severely impaired, but he was not. Became more specific to different areas that would not be associated with just frontal, just parietal, but an all-inclusive. So the blue means there's less activity compared to the database, and that turns out to be reasonably true, but either one of those singularly don't provide me the information, because the MRI can't give me frequencies that he's operating in or lacking in, and then the EEG can't tell me specifically where it is. So this would, if he were able to do the training, we would have continued, but he began having grand mal seizures. So just had to take time and see how they can manage that with medication. Okay, go to the next one.
Sorry, can I just, where's the lesion on it?
That is the bright, right? The really bright.
The red, the pink?
No, the red and the pink is the EEG activity. Oh. But where the EEG, right here in the MRI, the bright, really bright section.
Oh, I see, okay.
But also the really dark section, that's atrophied tissue as well. Okay, and to the next one. And I think the interesting one about this, if you look at, everybody here knows what a corpus callosum is, right? Well, if I had a pointer, I'd point to it. But right up here at the top of the little brain stem, see that corpus callosum is, in volume, it has diminished greatly. It does, compared to normal people, just the range of it. It's just so small. And it turns out there's enough research that says if the parietal lobes and their connections to the corpus callosum are damaged, the corpus callosum shrivels up. Because the corpus callosum is this magical cable, a wiring harness, if you will. It comes out like a beautiful butterfly. and it gets its data feedback back from the frontal lobes, parietal lobes, because it's plotting, afferent and efferent connections. That means you put the sensor information and then the body has to move, right? So for every connection this way, it's got one this way. And as those die, it starts to shrivel up. Then you have to think about what if it's not there in the first place? Then you just have data, it has no direction to go. It can't get to the sources in the brainstem that needs that information. So hopefully he'll do better. He got a dog, for epilepsy, just to predict procedures, it's like pulling teeth, but hopefully he'll get better as he goes along. Okay, next. All right, so here's one of those nice technical terms. So we really didn't have a definition for neurofeedback for a while. Everybody said, well, it's an operant conditioning procedure. Well, what does that mean? And most people say that. What does that mean? I don't know what that means. So it's an operant conditioning technique that uses the brain-computer interface and to influence the process is neuroplasticity and neural efficiency. And I think I have taken this stance that I don't really need to talk about disorders. Actually, insurance requires that. I don't have to participate in it if I don't want to. I can just work on improving self-regulation in an individual and provide them the diagnostic material they need to file insurance. But some people don't have ADHD. Some people don't have other issues. Some people have organic issues that have not been sought out. Because typically they won't order an MRI. I mean, it's really hard to get a child an MRI. It's really difficult to get an infant an MRI. Those are just areas I think could be improved anyway. So studies on physiological self-regulation of brain activity, and that is EEG-wise, have demonstrated over the course of 50 years that with appropriate training, individuals can learn to control their brain processes, brain activity. And likewise, studies with fMRI feedback, they can actually learn to activate or decrease activation in specific areas. So these are two huge areas of research. The main difference is EEG is a little bit less costly because the MRI machine is quite expensive. But I mean, as far as understanding the brain and understanding our control over certain things, it becomes a powerful thing to do. Okay. So there's the history of neurofeedback. So Caria, he showed the control of alpha activity. And actually they could control it, and then they were able to tell you when they were in that state, when that frequency was persisting over a source of time, which is kind of cool to think about it. So Stern in 81, but also in 67, and this is important to epilepsy research. So he had these cats, and he first NASA astronauts, they were getting sick when they were exposed to a certain type of fuel. They would have seizures. And that's bad for space progress and landing on the moon. So they used cats, and they would expose them to this particular fuel. And of course, they used stereotaxic electrodes that's implanted in the brain. But the cats, with proper feedback and reward reinforcement, could actually not have seizures. They could control the EEG activity by increasing SMR. And they would just attend, be alert, and they would not have a seizure. So then he implemented this on astronauts. Of course, they changed the fuel eventually, but for that period of time, people were able to actually regulate their behavior, which is pretty cool. So for ALS, and also more recently for patients who are locked in, there has been a great effort to at least hone in on certain EEG frequencies or fMRI signals to have them ability to communicate with the world. Maybe just think about if I got a person to think yes 100 times, and I averaged a mark of where that was, and then I didn't know in the same way, then even though they couldn't speak to me, they could actually communicate with that signal. And at least they've shown promising results. With that, still a lot of work to be done. So Weisskopf showed in 2003 that fMRI feedback, and that's the bold response, could be done. And people have learned to actually, over sessions, increase the activity in their brain relative to some feedback device. And today, I guess there have been numerous publications about showing favorable results. The cool thing about EEG biofeedback, neurofeedback, is in 60 years, I can't recall one report of serious injury, or sometimes it just doesn't work and people don't know when to stop, but it's fairly safe, and if a person's not going to respond, well, then they're not going to respond. But for depression, autism, addiction, traumatic brain injury, learning disabilities, and so forth. So one of the cooler papers was that in 2012, Beauregard and Gazier actually showed that as a result of SMR training, both white matter and gray matter increased or decreased respectively in the brain. So there were white matter and gray matter changes as a result of that. This was in children, but if a child can do it, so can an adult, because they are one and the same. They're a human being, and with proper feedback, they can. So, it does. It doesn't. That's yes. One of the great lies of the old is that the brain is stiff, constant, it doesn't change. And that's not true. Actually, it wants to learn. When we stop learning, that's when a problem starts. Okay. So this is an example of how fMRI feedback typically, because we might think that the more complex the stimulus is that we're watching, the better. Actually, the simpler the better. So they put you in a machine, they give you the focus on this, and they'll actually tell you, I need you to raise the bar or decrease the bar, respectively. And so you watch the bar. You have to figure out what in your brain will make this region activate, and the bar will give you a response. And then you learn how to keep doing it over sessions. So this is how typically most fMRI feedbacks do this. So for biofeedback and also neurofeedback, the things we're not aware of, if I am getting feedback about it, I can change it. And you might think of this in terms of, say, meditation. They can sometimes control even their heart rate, which is weird, very strange. But if they put attention on it, focus on it, you can change anything. It's just a matter of getting all the noise out of the way and attending to that thing. So sometimes it takes a little feedback because it's hard for us to be still, be quiet, reduce the noise, and focus on the thing we are trying to change. So feedback makes it easier to do. Okay, next one.
This can be done with kids who don't necessarily have the mission to understand commands. Like if you're asking them to put something in a specific place and say the kid doesn't have that mission.
Sometimes you have to trick them. Because every human being has a drive for reward. And reward requires one thing, movement towards something. Even if it's with our brain, towards creativity, whatever. But you have to move towards something. That's why dopamine becomes so important, because dopamine is also involved in not moving. So you can use a video game, or you can use even a movie. As long as they have the capacity to attend to a thing, which most kids do. I mean, even if they're distracted by everything else, they can focus on one thing. You find what that is, and they'll sit and watch, and their brain does not need their permission to engage in this process. Sounds kind of bad in sci-fi, but it's really good.
Question.
Yes.
So, can you give them something specific to work on that would help a specific portion of the brain? So let's say you have a child who's nonverbal and you want to develop certain, portions of the brain or pathways or whatever. Is it possible to have a test, a biofeedback test that's specifically going to target a portion of their brain?
It is. And, well, I was going to touch on it later, but sometimes I get ahead of myself, so I'll go ahead and touch on it now. So let's pretend for a moment that I have an autistic child coming. Has a word capacity of 4 words. Well, I can do the neurofeedback. I can get the brain ready to learn in an optimal way. But this is not the matrix. I cannot stick a thing in there and put data in it. So the thing that people really don't understand, that I've actually seen and put it into practice, is if they're going to speak language, then they need to do it every single day. Not once a week, not 3 hours a week, every day. They have to work on that in such a way. Why do we go to school every day? Why do they make us do that when we're children? Because they're punishing us? No. Your brain wants to learn quickly, efficiently, and then it does not want to use energy for that process again. So as the people are learning, as I just showed you, there'll be an increase in activity in the brain while you are practicing a task. And that could be math, that could be whatever, social skills, whatever you got. As an experiment, can y'all do this really quick? Just index thumb, go fast, go as fast as I move. All right. They've done experiments with humans and monkeys. They do this and they sit and practice. At first, over here in the motor cortex, you'll see an activation peak. It means it's taking a little energy to learn how to do this, right? I've done it so much as an example, I got it, right? It doesn't take any energy from me. So it's more of a negative slope. Apply that to everything you can imagine that a human being engages in. Mathematician. Each time he learns a new formula, same thing. There's more power being used. Once he gets it, no power. Basketball player, football player, pianist. And I'm going to show you some examples of this. It is true, everything we engage in, the brain wants to get it, and it wants to move on. I do not have to ever wake up and say, gee, I think I'll use language today. Do y'all have that experience? No. Unless I'm in another country. Then it becomes quite tiresome to listen to somebody, translate it, and then respond back to them. That'll kind of wear you out until you get it. Once you get it, you don't unlearn it. So, the same thing with this process. I can train the brain, I can interrupt networks that are dysfunctional, and that's the same with any kind of brain stimulation, but this is not. This is just providing feedback about it. But then the person has got to do. The brain must do for you to get it. You can tell me all day long how to do a differential equation, but until I write it down, I will not do it. And understand it in such a way. Okay. All right, so fMRI studies, and this is just a small, brief list, but they have done the sensory motor cortex, supplementary motor area, parahippocampal gyrus, anterior cingulate gyrus, subgenual cingulate gyrus, and also the amygdala. So just think of the implications of being able to train these areas up or decrease them in response to some stimulus or what have you. Can a person be better at regulating their emotions? Well, certainly if they were providing feedback about their brain, how it responds during that emotion, and how it responds without it. The same way with most things in the human experience. So, although this is a little more expensive, they can get to areas that the EEG cannot. Because right now we can't target white matter. It's mostly just gray matter. So, okay, the next one. So, LORETA neurofeedback, and I'll explain what LORETA is in a second, but that's one of my primary focuses in graduate school. Because I have always been fascinated by the brain, but also with self-regulation in general. And what that even means, because a lot of people talk about it, and a lot of people just dismiss it. You know, it's like, really? How can y'all dismiss a thing called self-regulation? First, there's got to be a self, and I got to be able to regulate the self, or I get in trouble a lot. So it becomes just this really weird phenomenon. So we have a training in the anterior cingulate. So has Cogito and Letsky. I've also done this in children and adults. The same with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the precuneus. And I'll explain more about why the precuneus becomes so important. Not only to this, but also this is the first time I've been to this conference, but just think of the white matter in the brain in general. And if it is all the direct result of learning, or an impairment to learning because pieces are missing. You got to think about where would we train, how would we, what part of the brain would we attack to actually spur on putting information there when there's a dysfunction in the whole structure of that, how that information is typically organized. Okay. So this is an example of the insular cortex. So session 1, they start out with the fMRI, trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I get this to move? How do I get the bar to go up? Session 2, they're right on the fringe of the insula. Session 3, more right insula than left, but the left is also starting to engage. And by session 4, they had learned to increase that significantly and dramatically. And that's important for 2 reasons. Usually, you know, we like to think that I'm right brain, I'm left brain. Well, it's nice. No, your whole brain. I'm left-handed or right-handed. But the brain operates with this schema of redundancy. So let's pretend for a moment that I'm shot in the side of the head over here where the language typically is. If the right Broca's area is destroyed, it is highly likely that I will be able to produce speech anymore. One of them has to remain. Brain can reorganize around a lot, but these redundant plots that come from corpus callosum, as they go out, you get a bit of data here, a bit of data here. It puts more on one side than the other. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist in both places, just less detail. So it becomes that the brain is symmetrical for a reason, but it's also symmetrical in function to a certain degree. Yes?
That's true, but now in the case of missing, like when the corpus callosum is missing and that redundancy doesn't exist.
That I do not.
Depending on whatever.
I think it depends on how many connections exist. I mean, because you're still going to have, things will circumvent the norm because the brain will still want to learn what it learns, how it learns. It still has to get information in there. I'm really not sure of how it does it, but I would surely like to understand it. I mean, really, that's a great important thing because perhaps it can just come straight up from brainstem. Because vagus nerve does. It does from the heart to the brain. But the brain does regulate the heart. So, I just tell y'all, when you say I have a broken heart, no, you have a broken brain. If you had a broken heart, you'd be dead. Oh, he's taking all the romanticism out of living anyway. Okay, go ahead, please. So this is what a neurofeedback procedure looks like. And if you just change the device there to an MRI scanner, it's pretty much the same result. So first you compare them to a database, and that gives you a target to go, depending on their symptoms, depending on their psychometric test. Because I test everybody, I don't care why they come to me. I focus on self-regulation, so I give them tests of attention, I give them tests of executive functions, I will give them personality measures, and when I say they're done, I provide evidence that they're done. I'll operate on an evidence-based model, that's what I like. So you put them up to the machine there, and this is with one electrode, but we use the cap because we use this source localization and give them feedback about that, but I'll go there in a second. So post-training, and this is the same map, and then compare them to the database over sessions. And you would expect them not to be one standard deviation out of that database. At least that's your goal. Because on any psychometric test, you must be at least 2 standard deviations out to have a significant difference in most cases. So 1.5, 1 standard deviation, in most cases not a big deal. 2, 3, 4, big deal. Then you show the differences, pre and post, that's within subjects. What you see, at least in a lot of studies now, because we're having problems with a lot of the placebo-controlled studies, is a simple learning curve. And I'll explain why that's so important, but you want to see that the person learned to change this activity, and if you are inhibiting another frequency, that they also drop that frequency. Then you want to show the psychometric changes, pre and post. There should be an improvement, at least 1 point, maybe 2 points, sometimes 5 points, but there should be a shift. That's the most important thing. Because yes, you can talk to parents, and parents have their own concern, but you also want to see objectively within the child a change. And then you present that evidence to the person. Because every person is a case study, at least as far as I can see. I should be able to publish every person's paper that comes and sees me, yes.
You get this improvement from this training, and does it stay with it, or do you have to like continuously train to keep that strength up? Or, I mean, you say you follow up 30 days, 6 months, 1 year, is it continuous there, or do you have to keep reinforcing it?
In most cases, you may touch up, and they'll come back and see you, maybe do 2 sessions. It depends on what the world is bringing at. Because a lot of kids, if they're 10, say they're getting ready to go to high school, oh my God, really? So you just touch them up and remind them that they have learned how to do this. Therefore, take 3 minutes to step out of the situation and just do what you did while you were doing the training. Because we do transfer trials as well. Let's turn off all the stimulus and say, all right, score some points. And most people can do that. So it's just, it is the coolest thing I've ever seen in all my training across numerous domains. Just to just see how a person, because I've done this myself. I did about 23 sessions, just to make sure it wouldn't hurt people. So I don't know if you're a scientist, but scientists tend to always work on stuff first. All I can tell you is the clarity that I have now compared to before I did that. I did it about 1.5 years ago. Because I had not trained the precuneus in any people. First, I wanted to make sure they wouldn't bite people or come out and stab people in the eye with pencils, because that would be bad for business if you have a result like that. It turns out, people say I'm kind of flippant or a little weird because I smile most of the time. I'm in a real positive way. I can even, I guess if necessary, cuss people out and smile at them at the same time. It just works out like that. I don't know why. But I think the clarity was the biggest thing. Because I can tell you now, probably within 1/100th of a second, when my insides shift. When something starts to irritate me, I can tell you almost right away. Therefore, I can put it down just as quickly as it began. Whereas prior to that, it might eat my lunch all day. So it's kind of cool. But for as far as attention goes and executive functions, those tests are what I'm after to see improvement in. Because, you know, for right now, I'm focused on ADHD. And I would expect to see a change in those tests if the primary deficits in ADHD are attention, self-regulation. Okay, thank you. There's my little baby Jack. That's when he was 5. So he used to help me. I'd have to check cats and make sure they were good. So I decided to say, well, I wonder if Jack could do this. Could he train his anterior cingulate? Actually, he was the youngest person in the world to do LORETA neurofeedback. It's pretty awesome. He's such a champ. He's done it about 12 times since then for his class. He'll get in there and hook up. But he can make that car fly and score a lot of points. So you hook him up with the cap, you localize a region in the brain, you change the current source density in that region. And people can do this, adults and children. The youngest was 4. But with them, you do have to use a DVD. Because the typical boring game is not so exciting. However, if you can get a movie in there, and the movie, the sound and hearing it, and the visual display, seeing it is dependent on them decreasing artifacts, and maintaining the current source density at a region, they can do it this one. So I still give him a lot of thanks for that cute little picture right there. Okay, go ahead to that. All right. All right, so operant conditioning. Well, in both respondent and this is Pavlov's experience, Thorndike, and all down the road, all the behaviorists in the world, the person or animal acquires a behavior that the individual did not previously possess. And that is also relative to cells, because one single neuron can learn. If you provided a frequency to fire on, that neuron can learn to fire in that frequency, which is very strange. So you would always plot a learning curve for any kind of neurofeedback, and this was actually for 13 people who trained in the anterior cingulate. So you want them to show an increase, a linear increase, but you also want to somewhat decrease the variation over time. Because you can take a rat and put him in a cage and have a lever and a light. how likely is it that the rat will go push the lever of its own volition? There's not a very good chance. Rats aren't going to play with you. So first you have to deprive them a little bit. Then you have to lead them with food to get them to the lever. And then eventually they'll try it out because you have shaped that behavior to a certain degree. So that response has to occur at a minimum rate so that you can reinforce that. So the difference between reinforcement is not a reward. A lot of people don't understand that. So when they're sitting there playing this video game, the game responding to their brain is the reinforcement. The sound, the tone where they get a point for scoring, that is the reward. Because adult or child, they will want to do better each time. If they score 20 points this time, they want to do 40 next time. And it goes, and so on. And people get really disturbed when they're not meeting that criteria, right? So I call that the Vulcan mind, though, because they'll try to score points and they get tense when they are irritated and they don't score any points. So I stop and ask them, are you using the force again, Luke? Stop. So anyway. So the reward is a thing of value to an organism. So sometimes you might have to offer them $5 or whatever. Maybe an M&M, but mostly kids like money, but they also like points. And their perceived deficit in many cases is real. So you do not have to deprive them because that already exists. Anytime they are different, set apart from what a normal population is, automatically there is a perceived deficit. And at least that's what I work toward, is to change that deficit and make them aware of the change. And we all do that. I wouldn't go, if I were a high-level executive, I wouldn't want peak performance training because I'm perfect. There would always be something I can do better. And that's an inherent quality for humans, I think, especially those who are higher performing anyway. And shaping the response becomes quite important. So it must be shaped. And we do that all through elementary school. The whole process involves you shaping so you can get to college and do what you got to do of your own volition because you want to do it, rather as opposed to that you have to. Right? Okay, good. Okay, so in another sense, operant conditioning describes how we develop behaviors that operate on the environment. And this becomes more specific to an individual. So even a person with impairment on their environment, they want to operate on it and they want the environment to respond in some way. Otherwise, what's the use, right? So it becomes important that at least the response that occurs with some minimum frequency, and most EEG does. So you have to hone in on it and try to reinforce that so they can produce it more. Because we do know some things about EEG, not everything, but we do know that attention is modulated by certain ranges. So is encoding and retrieval of memory processes. And I suppose it would go down the list if we just could actually separate these out a little better. But as contrasted with respondent conditioning, and that's Pavlov conditioning. Operant conditioning involves associating with a response with a stimulus event rather than a stimulus with a stimulus. So you see the bell, you got the food, you salivate. With this, you see a light, and you generate a response to it. So they would salivate to the light, not to the bell or whatever. Okay, go ahead. So these are rats trying to escape from cages. And these are the minutes that it took to escape. So Thorndike proposed that an act that is closely followed by satisfaction, pleasure, or comfort will be learned, whereas an act followed by discomfort will be forgotten or eliminated. And this is really a good theory. It's more called the law of effect, but it doesn't apply to everything. And I think that's, if you give psychology an exception, they'll focus on the exception rather than the rule. So in most cases, this works just fine. In other cases, not so much. Addiction being one. So I do that in West Palm now. That doesn't make any sense at all compared to this thing. All right, next. And incremental nature, so y'all are all aware of the principle of small increments. I can't take a 3-year-old and put differential equations in front of him and say, do that. learn that and see how you do it. First, I have to teach them math, addition, subtraction, the rules, the laws, all the good stuff. But you do that in small pieces. The same thing with neurofeedback. I can't sit a person down and set a threshold at 90% and have them score 500 points and expect any result whatsoever. They do have to know that they are working towards, you see it progress over time. So it can't be all at once, because nothing shifts. A little bit each time. I think we forget about that, especially with children with disabilities, is that you still have to do it a little at a time. Some things have to be put to the side, and you're focusing on just their well-being, their health, and what have you, but you still have to do it a little bit at a time. So you can get to a level to see, okay, what's a strength, what's a weakness? Because everyone has those. Sometimes you just need to be able to focus on the strengths to focus on the weaknesses, right? Okay, great. All right, so we all know neuroplasticity, right? It's this wonderful process whereby the brain reorganizes itself and it wants to change itself so that more data can be added to a topic. So I think of this in terms of a box of Crayola crayons. So when you're little, you got that box of 8 crayons. How many blues are in that box? 1. So then you get to teenage years and they throw a trick at you and you get this box of 64 crayons. How many blues are in that box?
4 or 5.
About 12 maybe? So then you get more and there's more blue. Well, if you do not have facilities and things are not, synapses are not created and things prune, it'll always be one blue. You would never have a different shade of blue. And unfortunately, some people, that's what you got. And that's hard to escape from, right? So efficiency, that when you said blue, there would be no energy associated with that, none whatsoever. Just like this, just like playing guitar, just like if you practice piano for years, you do not have to think about it, you get up and do it. It does not require any energy or volition from you. So that's what the brain wants to do. And for most cases, and I'll show you some evidence of its practice effect, the thing that you practice becomes the thing that does not take energy. Because your brain wants to be free to learn novel information, not practice what is already there. Because I got it. Okay? Yeah. All right, so this was another interesting case. So this was 10 years post-accident. He just wanted to try it to see if it would help him with seizures, with being able to remember, being able to talk. So he had such bad tremors that actually his caregiver had to hold him, his shoulders still. It's still a bad EEG, all this slow activity. But what it doesn't provide you is this weird EEG, if you think about it. Pretend a person has a tick, a tick like this. It's kind of slow, where you can count it in a second period. 1, 2, 3, 4. Their movements will equate to the brain firing. 1, 2, 3, 4, and the frequency with which it fires in. The sound might sound weird to you, but it turns out it makes sense. If behavior is brain, then what you're seeing is a frequency within the brain at some area that's causing this movement. So this was pre-training and all this beta activity, that's the high frequency dark stuff in the back. That could be injury related, that could be compensatory, just wasn't sure. But go ahead and pop the slide and another picture will come up. So after 60, that's what happened. So the top is eyes open, bottom is eyes open. So there's a shift. Is he perfect? No. Is he tremoring? No. Seizures have reduced in combination with meds. He still has to take meds for them. He might have to his whole life. But he could remember more. You could understand him. His words were, you could actually hear what he was saying and understand what he was saying. It was not so good before. So, and then these cases, it's just an example. You provide this kind of information. You would also have pre and post testing specific to whatever it is they wanted to change. Like you could do a verbal fluency test. I didn't do it at the time. This was actually early in my career. Doing research as well. But for a person, it depends on where you set the bar. For some people, 50% increase is huge. Perhaps they will never be in a normal range. 50% is huge. In some cases, it's everything. So, go ahead to the next. All right, so the goal of neurofeedback, at least in the papers in more recent years, first, self-regulation. Then you can follow up with other things, but once you get the ability to attend, to be still, to self-regulate, other things will follow. But what I have shown in a couple of papers is if I use personality measures as also an end result, the more you improve attention self-regulation, the less psychopathology is endorsed across children and adults. So there's something to it. The better I can regulate, the less energy it takes for me to self-regulate, the more open I am to process information that is new, and therefore I just get the disturbance, get the noise out of the way, and it provides better opportunity to learn. Okay. All right, so this is what LORETA does. So you'll have to click this like 3 times. Click it once. So you take the EEG, and this would be synonymous with, analogous to taking cell phones. So you got all these satellite towers across the face of the earth. Then you got, the signal towers. Then you got satellites in space. So you can take your cell phone, turn it on, and they can triangulate down to you within 2 square centimeters and locate your signal. Same principle here for the brain. The only question is, what does the source of an EEG mean? Well, that's still open to some debate. I would say you never have a singular source. You have the source of contribution to the EEG on the scalp, but brainstem and thalamus are the only sources of EEG we understand right now. So the source is there, but we can't monitor it there as such. So we get it in the cortex, how it contributes to the EEG on the scalp. And we can do that. This would be the total, the red would be. Okay, click it again. Or you have each frequency, because the frequencies tend to live and reside in different areas of the cortex. For example, with eyes closed, alpha becomes more prominent everywhere, but mostly in the parietal area. So a decrease in alpha over the lifespan actually is used as an indicator of dementia, especially Alzheimer's. So that's one of the tests they give you. So it becomes important. Too much theta over the motor cortex, that's typically associated with ADHD, the range of theta to beta. So the potential for diagnostic clarification, if you will, is great, but we're still working towards that direction across numerous domains in science. And then one more click. And you can also look at the correlations between areas, relative to a task or relative to training in general. So this version of LORETA that is used for neurofeedback has 2,394 7mm cube voxels, or brain volume elements. Okay, next one. And this is the typical placement of electrodes. And this would be the anterior cingulate, which we have trained. What's really cool about this is that particular paper and that training with normal college students, they increased IQ by 11 points. I don't really harp on that too much, but people say, do you want to talk to everybody about that? I'm like, because I was just curious to do it to see what would happen. But if you use a waist 3, it would be waist 4 now, working memory and processing speed, they did improve 11 points, which was kind of cool. All right, next one. So that's a nice little picture. So what if we could get areas related to focus, attention, emotional control, concentration, follow through and motivation, or even just a general interest in whatever it is? What about math? What about this last one? This is what my practice in South Florida operates on there, positive brain training. It's the coolest idea you've ever heard of, but I'll give you a link, y'all can look at it yourself. Okay, next one. All right, so the brain, learning, and practice. So mastery of a subject or skill requires how much? If you go to graduate school, 10,000 hours. That's why we go to graduate school, 10,000 hours. So what does that mean? Well, for language, if you're going to develop language and use it, 10,000 hours. Math, if you're going to be good at it, Efficient at it, 10,000 hours. Think about this over the course of a lifespan. Think about it over the course of 10 years in school. You know, never really added up how much time in high school I spent on math. But sometimes I wasn't good at it. And that would take a little longer than others. So business, farming, academia, it doesn't really matter what you do. Your profession, your chosen task, the thing that you love to do, you must practice it to learn it and do it. That accounts with everything human, right? So now that we understand that rule, go ahead. So quite quickly, sometimes I put too much text on slides, but that's just the professor in me. All right, so these you have little specialized processes that come in the brain over the course of development. So in the environment, it contributes to the neural landscape. All right, so genetics determines the structure in some cases. Well, the environment determines the neural landscape, what you're exposed to. This is why I always use racism as an example. A person is raised in a certain environment and told, this is true, this is true, this is true, this is true, this is true. Of their own volition and control, they will probably persist in that their entire life until they experience something different. And it brings into question the thing that they were told was true. So, I mean, that becomes really important as far as the brain goes. How would you interrupt that network? How would you reconfigure that if you can? You can be done. In some cases, yes, some cases, no. All right, so an adult-like resting activity, default network, is observed by the first year of development. So quickly, the default network is 12 regions in your brain, in the posterior cingulate, the ventral anterior cingulate, these regions on the left, one region on the right prefrontal. So if I close my eyes, they're raised in power compared to the same areas with my eyes open. And I always have more power with eyes closed, even more so than a cognitive task. So a default network, they say, well, it could be resting, it could be relaxing. Well, as I told you earlier, it's more attention and self-regulation. But outside of this whole talk, I'll tell you, I've been interested in one thing, and pretty much one thing only, a self. Because what is more default than self? Absolutely nothing. And I became interested in that in Alzheimer's research. Because I was curious as when a patient would stare in a mirror and they would know me, they had no idea who that was sitting in front of them. And it was them. They could not recognize the self anymore. And there are certain areas that when they have become atrophied, that becomes a persistent problem. So I'm real interested in that. But all cortical regions studied in humans are subject to rise and fall in synaptic density, and that this persists over the lifetime. This does not just go away. We are always capable of learning until we're not. When we're not, that's when usually the problems start. The most rapid increase in white matter, the first 2 years of development. And this one back here, this one here, that's why I got little stars on it. So myelination appears to begin at birth in the pons and cerebellar peduncles, I love that word, and by 3 months has extended to the optic radiation and the splenium of the corpus callosum. Do you know probably the most infamous area in attention deficit disorder? The one that persists the most over the course of a lifetime. Castellanos et al., if you ever look him up, the splenium of the corpus callosum. So what if ADHD is really a disorder of the corpus callosum? And we should be looking parietal, as close as we can get to parietal, as opposed to frontal. And I believe that's very true. And I do have some data coming out of the paper later on this year that shows that that might be true. Because if you just think about the brain evolved this way, data is added this way, then one shearing of a network is enough to disrupt 5, 6, 7 other nodes in that network. So, I mean, people I think underestimate the importance of the callosum to everything. If it's like a cableway, which monitors the inside of the world, outside of the world, and plots courses for you to act and plots behaviors and responses. one little fray would be pretty difficult to deal with. So by 8 to 12 months, white matter associated with frontal parietal and occipital lobes becomes apparent. The data has been assimilated, encoded, and colonized. But, you know, I typically believe that once we hit this world, we start learning even in the womb. We're exercising our movements and what have you, regulating heartbeat in that little place. We don't want to come out here in this cold hell, but there we go, we pop out, and we adjust pretty quickly. The brain learns quick. Heart rate, heart regulation, respiration, all that good stuff. So, all right, next one. All right, so this is what's magical about this precuneus, is I couldn't really target the splenium if I wanted to with the EEG techniques. It's just not feasible right now with the technology we have. Perhaps in a few years we could. But just the connections for this area to all these other areas. So what I have done, I guess I have 160 people. I have used a standardized protocol on training this area in one frequency first for 17 days. And in most cases, I'll let you read the paper, but ADHD tends to swim to the wayside, which is pretty cool. But for other disorders, like autism, Asperger's, depression, anxiety, the self-regulation becomes much more improved. They don't have to use a lot of energy to sit and be still because a lot of kids cannot maintain this motor movement. I mean, it uses up a lot of their resources. If they can be still and not have to work so hard at it, then it becomes easier to actually teach them the little things we would like to teach them. So, it's a very important area. It's associated with a lot of places within the brain, but also other networks. Because there are certain hubs within the brain that are vital to other networks and nodes and hubs and just how the whole thing communicates together. Okay, next. So, Bott and Lories, they talked about it being a critical linkage between brainstem arousal and posterior cingulate and the retrosplenial cortex. So if you think about language in general, just posterior cingulate, we published a paper, I guess it was 2008, in Alzheimer's disease. So when the connections between posterior cingulate and the hippocampus are damaged, so are the connections to the whole brain. So what if I tell you that language rides up the course of the corpus callosum? Because you can look back at Russia a long time ago. Is thought really speech? Yeah, it is. I don't ever have a thought that's not words. If I do, I couldn't tell you what it is anyway. I wouldn't be able to describe it, would I? So, you got to step outside the box for just a second and say, maybe they were right back then. And if I lose language, everything is gone. And actually, end result of Alzheimer's disease, when they go to critical care, they cannot generate one word. That becomes very important, because most things we do are described in words, definitions for the words, the emotional salience of the words, and so on and so forth. So, being able to understand how much a person has in that context becomes quite difficult, but sometimes we can aid them in getting there with a dedicated word. All right, so this is one prominent area, but you can also go in and target this area to train. And I've done this without any weird results, nothing strange, but I do this after the first one. I kind of move through the brain and go to the next slide, and I'll kind of show you why we do this. All right, so see the little white band below all those dots? That's the corpus callosum. Right above the corpus callosum is the cingulate cortex. So you have posterior cingulate, middle cingulate, and in the red, anterior cingulate and subgenual cingulate. So not only me, but several other authors, if you just think about a hub and these vital hubs in the brain, they would be connected to everything. Well, this posterior cingulate, anterior cingulate, these are always implicated in some kind of disorder. It doesn't matter what it is. They are always hit in research. And it can be that they are underdeveloped, less volume, and that just means there's not really much data available or too much. Right? So I have trained each one of these areas. The coolest thing about this, so I train the back, precuneus posterior cingulate, more words, better attention. I train the front, better attention, but not an experience of a calm or a positive effect. People just describe it as being more focused. The subgenual cingulate, at least people become aware that other things, at least with OCD type behaviors, they can interrupt it for a second, doesn't persist long, but I'm still working on that one. The mid cingulate, we don't often associate that with movement, but it turns out, and this should come out later next year, as soon as I finish it up, I got so much to do, I'm tired. Wish I had a lab these days. That's a bad thing about going out in private practice. I don't have a lab, I need to build one. This mid cingulate, we don't consider it as a spot for movement, if you will, even though it's right under the motor cortex, almost. However, I have seen in most kids with Tourette's or tics, this area is inflated with activity, it's too much activity, EEG-wise. So if I go in and target that particular frequency, and I train it down, gee, the tic goes away. In Tourette's, they will actually be able to stop that movement. So it's just like a misfiring habit. And if you think about how that interrupts attention, you cannot attend when you're ticking. It's like your brain is doing something else and it's not on task. So that's a pretty cool thing, and hopefully, let's say by next year that'll be out. But this girdle is directly related to the corpus callosum. So I do not know how the cingulate is affected as a result of, say, agenesis or what have you. But that would actually be a good study for somebody to do, to check out how those neurons are they there like a normal sample, or has it shifted? Perhaps it even becomes to act as if it has some properties of corpus callosum. Yes?
When you're doing the testing with folks that have attention deficit, let's say they have ACE or not, let's say they're on medication,
Right.
on Ritalin type, do you do a trial with them on medication and off medication to see differences, or do you just go sort of pure without any medication?
No. If they don't take their medication, they can't be still, this isn't going to work.
So they get
I don't comment on the meds, I don't prescribe them, I just say call your doc and you tell him what he's getting ready to do. Turns out that almost every child, after about 8 sessions, because these are consecutive days, they come 17 days in a row, 20 days in a row, except for Sunday. So about session 8, session 10, they call the doc, the kid is irritable, he is a little bit unable to sleep and has headaches. Take the stimulants away, no problem. And that's persists across adults as well. And I did publish that data, so I'll send you a link. But I gotta have them to be still, so I don't really comment on them as if they can't be still. They can't really attend, you can't jump around and do all this stuff. So it becomes necessary, and who knows, people have been arguing so long about stimulants or neurofeedback or blah, 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 blah. Well, nobody ever really thought about what would be a perfect combination if you could. Maybe a little dose of stimulants, learn how to do something different, train the brain, and maybe it'd work out where you didn't have to be stuck on meds.
You were saying that you do 17 to 20 days. Do you do it a block for 17 to 20 days and then they come back every week, every month? I mean, what is the standard therapy procedure?
What we do those days, say 20 days, and they come back in 30 days, and we follow up. Because sometimes people have different issues, and if you get the self-regulation down, you get the noise out of the way, you start to see a more glaring pattern of activity that was not there prior to. Because if you take stimulants, that might interrupt the tick, it might subside it a bit, but after you train out, then the tick will become more obvious, and you're like, okay, maybe that was it to begin with. So we'll follow up at 30 days, and sometimes they may have to come back. It depends on what they're doing in life, how old they are, and just what their level of, self-monitoring is, because a lot of kids I work with are in private schools, high expectations, and they're real critical of themselves. So they get anxious a little bit. And anxiety, I'm sorry, if I have a little bit of, if I'm anxious, I will only get 10% of what you said at any point in time. So they can come back and just do a touch-up. They come back in 6 months, we retest, we make sure they persist, and then we just follow up a year later. But they do not typically have to come back and do further training for more than 2 or 3 sessions. Because you just have to remind them, you know, you did this, your brain is already here. Just take a minute, pause, see how it goes.
If someone comes to you with an EEG seizure just at its onset, and you know exactly where it's going to be taking place, with that amount of information, can you put together a program of neurofeedback to try to kind of develop that area or stabilize it? Or?
You can. They have done that over the past 20 years. And they had actually really good results for monitoring seizure activity. That if you make them aware of a particular pattern, they can reduce that. Because typically a seizure may start in one area. As example, the left temporal lobe. So it'll start, there's a little ictal phase, if you like. Then it'll propagate. And once it propagates, there you go, the whole cortex is devoted to that seizure. I did have a friend, he had a progressive supranuclear palsy, and while he could still speak, he told me, he said, Rex, when I have those seizures, it's the language of God. And I was like, what? He said, there's nothing else. There's no words, there's nothing else. I was like, okay, I've never heard it described that way. But what if you could actually be aware of when, because it's going to operate in a typical frequency range, typical amplitude. If you can hone in on that, because there is residual after you have a pattern of seizures, you might have too much slow activity, and usually that will be true compared to another baseline or a group, you know, another normative database. There may be too much delta, there may be too much theta, it can even be high frequency activity. It depends on those that are just, for no other reason, they should not, you know, they shouldn't be that high. And it will persist in certain areas, but it's more ventral. And you can target it over the cortex. And typically it's just SMR frequency that they train. Because it worked in cats, it works in humans. For whatever reason, that particular range has some, the source is located in the thalamus, and perhaps that performs some regulatory role. We still don't really understand what changes all the way, but we just know people do, they're able to actually regulate the seizure. Okay, next one. That's a sagittal view, and that actually has all your connections as they come up out of the corpus callosum. So, we do know that there is this wonderful interplay between the cingulate and the corpus callosum. Don't know how it looks if the corpus callosum is gone, but I would imagine some compensatory mechanism does take place. I'm just not sure of what it looks like. Okay. And usually, if you have children who play sports, frontal pole, temporal pole are most likely to be injured in concussive type injuries. I used to play football too, so I might have had a couple. But I guess over the course of life, the lifespan, that's problematic, right? At least we're finding out now with the NFL and what have you. Okay. All right, so this was a nice little study of children who practiced violin versus those who did not. They weren't, had no experience with violin, what have you. So they practiced every day, 5 hours for 2 months, I think it was. And you'll notice that up here in the internal capsule and the isthmus over the corpus callosum, you see an increase in volume relative to the practice, and then a decrease over time. So as they're learning, you see more activation and more volume. We'll go to the next one. And what they did in this one is they recorded, they put them in the fMRI, or MRI machine, they had them recorded them while they moved their pinkies. So the right pinky and the left pinky. And they did that pre and post. So at the top is the left little finger movement, and the bottom is the right post. So post-training, the left finger all of a sudden becomes associated with motor cortex, visual spatial areas, language areas, all kinds of areas it should not be associated with. However, if you think about a violin and what they're doing, they have to have a spatial map of this thing they're doing. There are letters involved, notes, if you will. And they actually, all those areas, this little network becomes bedazzled in the brain and becomes associated with moving that fingernail. Whereas the right, there's really not a shift because it just has the bow and do a lot. So imagine, if you will, this applies to everything I've talked about in the mastery and just the things that people learn, how they learn. So I think in some areas it will be more difficult than others. Go ahead. But this is one of those cool studies. I don't know if y'all have ever seen this, but London taxi drivers. Y'all ever ridden a taxi in London? What's wrong with those people? Anyway, so they go through all these weird angles and ways to get around the city. So if you take that and compare it just to people who drive in London who are not taxi drivers, it turns out that the bilateral hippocampi, they have more volume but less effort. If they could actually get them during that task, it probably wouldn't take any energy to find a place, whereas it take a person not from London hours to get there. So the brain changes relative to what we do, how often we do it, and eventually it does not want to use energy to do it. Okay, next one. All right, so this is one study we did that actually spawned me on to the precuneus. So these are adults, and that's a fMRI. While they are completing, this is the baseline, and we did that contrasted with a Stroop task. And this is how you can map out a network with the EEG, which the color of the line would correspond with that region's correlation with the other region. So that's the default network there. And down here at number 2, that is actually the precuneus, the area that we train. Because alpha frequency, for whatever reason, is skewed in ADHD. We often think of theta, but it turns out several studies have shown that as alpha rises in the parietal lobes, theta decreases in the frontal lobes and vice versa. So alpha has some weird property, and I do believe that it's more of an integration, if you will. And perhaps even one EEG frequency may perform this carrier wave operation, but I'm not sure yet. We just don't know. Okay, next one. All right, so this is my little kids. So 17 days, I'm just going to through this briefly. So their mean age was 7 and 17. So they completed this neurofeedback for 17 to 20 consecutive days. Go to the next one. All right, so this is a little network. You know, this paper should be out, I think, by the end of the month. So I went through the research and I looked at most areas that were hit the most time in ADHD using MRI imaging or fMRI. And it turns out the precuneus, the insula, and this is right, the right cingulate gyrus, the subcolossal gyrus or orbital frontal cortex, and the posterior cingulate. Because I don't know if y'all have ever assessed ADHD children, but you would expect them to have a verbal fluency deficit. But every single one has. Put under task and given rules, they cannot generate the proper number of words. They can't switch between categories naming words. So if you think about how we self-regulate, I talk myself through every problem. There has not ever been a problem I have not taught myself through. So you got to think about access to data, access to words. It becomes quite important. All right, so we trained one area of the precuneus, and I wanted to see what happened to these other areas. Okay, next. So that's the little learning curve, and that's a percentage of reward over time. And up here, sorry, the letters are so small. That's just what happens, and because my laptop's about this big, so I was working on it last night. So the precuneus increased, and it's not a super increase, but most of the other regions, as a result of this precuneus increasing that much, they decrease. So if you think about over time, with practice, getting feedback about being still, self-regulating, it takes less energy in the alpha range, the training range, which either before they were maybe 100 microvolts on the scalp, which is way too much, or not quite enough. It just depends on the medication they were taking, and really what they were doing during baseline. But they improved across the attention task dramatically, the executive functions moderately, but I do believe with I think the addition of 25, 26 more, because I'm supposed to have this ready for Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, by the 30th. Good luck, Rex. Okay. but I'm working on it. Go ahead to the next one. All right, so this is a nice review. Sorry I didn't put her name, but it's Kelly and Garavin. They covered practice, all the studies of practice in the human brain and the changes. This was verbal fluency, this was violin, this was actually mapping out guitar string, guitar notes while you're in the fMRI scanner. Everything that a person could do practice-wise. There is always an increase, and then once the person has it, there's always a decrease, that it takes less energy. There's also more volume available as well, depending on the experience. And if you think in the long term, yes, you have a lot of volume, a lot of data points, but then you want that to be trimmed down as well, to make it more efficient, less energy. Let's just go. Okay, next one. So these are just correlations between certain areas. And what you're going to find is over the course of maybe 3 years, they talk about the brain as a whole connectome now. So it's one giant network with many different facets and hubs. So as we run through that, we'll see more complex maths like this, but I think this is quite beautiful. I just thought I'd show you that. So he actually did a very nice book of the white matter pathways in the brain, which, just remember Catania. Okay, we're ready. Let's go. I bet we're close to the end. All right, go to the next one. I just said that. Said that too. Go. That's beautiful. There you go. There's some networks. All right, next. Next. Beautiful. Okay. So quite simply, neurofeedback does offer potential. There's a lot to do research-wise, but it doesn't step out of the realm of common sense and human experience. If I practice something, if I'm giving feedback about it, then I can change it, whether it's in my body or what have you. Yes?
How long until this is commercially available where we got to?
It is already here. That day has arrived a couple of years ago. The more technologically advanced version, it is also available. So it can't hurt a person, but you should read up on brain just a bit before a person starts, especially EEG, because you don't want to train the wrong thing. I wouldn't. That's why I've always been kind of a little bit, I like to have a facility where I can train people so I can watch them when I'm doing it. But they're all here, and for most studies, at least with certain disorders, the long-term benefits are measured out 4 years, 3 years, and you still see a cognitive shift and the symptoms do not return. And then the next one. All right, so ISNR, I'm here because of them. They're very wonderful, and there's some information about that. Brain Treatment South Florida, that's my own plug, braintreatment.com. And we're having a conference in San Diego in October. I forget, see that? Last night I got distracted and I forgot to put the 12th on there. But we did, I think Kathleen, I did offer her an invite to come speak there. So she gets some information about this place, because I'm sure there are people in our organization who would value this organization as well. So thank you for your attention, I appreciate it.